Welcome to Tales of the Alleghenies, Episode 11, A Little Known Disaster. The following story came about by sheer accident. I was contacted by a man who had a relative who was wounded and died on July 2nd, 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg. The soldier's name was Hiram Statler, and I'm here at Hiram's grave marker, located at the Independent Order of Oddfellows Cemetery in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The relative wanted proof that the soldier was actually buried in this cemetery, because many times families could not afford to have their loved ones brought home from a distant battlefield. We found revealing information in a newspaper obituary dated the 24th of September, 1897. George Statler, a brother to Hiram, brought Hiram's body back to Johnstown 2 weeks after the battle. You may ask, what does this have to do with the title of this episode? Well, after researching George Statler a little further, I found George was an artist and photographer who lived in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Another newspaper, dated the 21st of September, 1897, went on to say that Mr. Statler in 1866 had photographed what I call a little known disaster. I'm standing on the overlook of the inclined plane in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Here in the Alleghenies, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, over its long history, has fallen victim to many devastating disasters. Johnstown has had flooding over the millenniums due to its geological formation that created a steep, narrow valley. The entire nation has heard about the Great Flood of 1889, where 2,209 people perished. Let's not forget about the 25 lives lost in the St. Patrick's Day flood of 1936. And more recently, the 84 lives lost in the flood of July 19 and 20, 1977. A little known disaster struck Johnstown on September 14, 1866. The country was struggling to recover from the aftermath of the American Civil War. The tensions of Reconstruction over the social and economic quandary of the emancipated black population was a major issue. Disputed was whether or not the Southern leaders of secession should be punished for treason and war crimes. Then there was the balance of political power between Northern and Southern states for the House of Representatives and the Senate seats of the United States. These were a few of the daunting challenges facing our great nation. With the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865, the reins of power fell to Vice President Andrew Johnson in September of 1866. Johnson was winding down what the press called swing around the circle. This was an unprecedented 18-day midterm election tour, traveling by rail car to major cities and whistle stops throughout the Northeast and Midwest. Johnson assembled VIPs like Ulysses S. Grant, General George Custer, Admiral David Farragut, Secretary of State William Seward, Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, and others in hopes to rally support from citizens concerning his post-Civil War Reconstruction policies. I'm standing on the platform of a caboose on the location of the old railroad station that was here in 1866 when this event happened. It was Friday, September 14th, about 10:30 in the morning, when President Johnson and his entourage stopped at Pennsylvania Railroad Station in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, en route back to Washington, D.C. The old station house, no longer standing, was situated on the south bank of the old Pennsylvania Canal. The canal was dry and was used by the Johnstown and Conemaugh Railroad. Immediately north and in front of the station house, the Pennsylvania Railroad crossed the canal diagonally on an iron bridge. Between the station and the rail track extending eastward over the canal was a 2,150 square foot wooden platform built by the railroad company for passengers to enter and exit the passenger cars. The platform also accommodated taking baggage on and off the railroad cars. President Johnson, General Grant, and Admiral Farragut had just stepped out of their passenger car door and onto the end platform of the car to be introduced. An enthusiastic crowd of between 2,000 and 3,000 had gathered at the station to get a glimpse of these famous dignitaries. The cheers and jubilation continued until disaster struck. The center of the platform, where many hundreds of people had gathered, snapped. Bodies cascaded headlong and timbers plummeted about 20 feet into a canal below, onto the tracks of the Johnstown-Conemaugh Railroad. Seconds after the center collapsed, the remains of the platform attached to the abutments above crashed down upon the helpless victims. It was a mangled mass of heavy timbers and broken bodies. One reporter said the air was filled with flying splinters, which penetrated the flesh of so many. Cries from the bleeding and dying, calling for help, left no words to describe the horrors of this ghastly scene. Rescue began immediately by every willing person. Neighborhood houses became makeshift hospitals. Unfortunately, several of the Johnstown physicians were among the injured. The railroad telegraph agent wired for immediate help in all directions. Within 2 hours, dozens of doctors were on the scene from all over the area, even from Pittsburgh. Agent Robert Given from the Pennsylvania Railroad compiled the initial list of the dead and wounded, which included name, age, town, and the kind of injury. The exact count of the dead and injured, from my research, has never been established. Among the hundreds of injured, many had panicked and fled the scene before they were recorded. Amazingly, the number of deaths were surprisingly low, between 13 and 17. Here again, the true count may never be known, because according to some obituaries I found, several people succumbed to their injuries days, weeks, and months after the incident. Some deaths were never printed during that time period. The presidential party felt great remorse and wanted to assist in whatever means possible. Railroad officials told the president that the train must move immediately to clear the tracks of scheduled rail traffic. President Johnson requested that the United States Deputy Marshal James O'Byrne and others of his party to stay behind and assist in the relief effort. O'Byrne was a Civil War Medal of Honor recipient and better known as the person appointed by Secretary of War Stanton to oversee the pursuit and capture of John Wilkes Booth and the other conspirators following the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Also, President Andrew Johnson that very day from Altoona, Pennsylvania, wired $500 to Daniel Morrell. The letter stated that the President deeply sympathizes with the families who have suffered by the terrible accident at Johnstown today, and requested that the enclosed amount may be applied to the relief of the most needy of the bereaved and wounded. Even with all the President's genuine concerns, leaving staff behind to render assistance and sending money for needy victims, newspapers across the country chastised and berated him for leaving the scene. I never read who arranged for the President to stop in Johnstown, but if I had to guess, it would be Daniel J. Morrell. Mr. Morrell was the CEO of the Cambria Iron Company, president of 2 banks, and controlled the water and gas companies. Morrell was the most powerful man in Johnstown at the time and was running for his first term in Congress. He successfully won the congressional seat and was elected to the 2nd term. Daniel Morrell also gave $200 and pledged $1,000 from the Cambria Iron Company. General John Geary was running for governor of Pennsylvania and would eventually win 2 terms. Also wired $200 for the relief effort. A city resolution was unanimously passed to give the proceeds of 1 day's labor or business on the following Monday to the relief effort. To give you an idea of the value of $100 in 1866, the current 2024 inflation valuation would be worth $1,979.85. In summary, the Swing Around the Circle campaign proved to be a political disaster for President Johnson. Even sheet music, titled Swing Around the Circle, was composed by E.W. Locke in 1866 and sung at the Soldiers and Sailors Convention in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that would deride the President's trip. We believe the photographs taken of this event by George Statler that I mentioned in the opening of this episode were tragically lost in the flood of 1889. Many archives have been checked for the photographs to no avail. Can you imagine how valuable these photographs would be today? As for the old adage, time will heal, for the most part this may be true, but many carried the trauma and their bodily scars of this tragic day in September to their graves. The calamity of this event in Johnstown would be overshadowed by the future disasters, but surmounted by the fortitude of a brave and industrious people. Thank you for watching this episode of Tales of the Alleghenies.